Hello, everybody. So here we go. We are going to spend some time genuinely talking about existence, the meaning of life, and some of the more broad arguments surrounding this. Again, please keep in mind that aliens probably do exist somewhere, so in a group dynamic sense, we can consider humanity as a single group. That means the outgroup is off-world, but our world is essentially a biological spaceship, self-contained, a closed system, if you will, that requires our stewardship and our care and our perceiving ourselves as within a larger interdependent web of existence in order to maintain an environment that is healthy and livable for us as a species. It's absolutely true that we are capable of dominating it and exploiting its resources to the extent of getting off world, terraforming Mars, populating the asteroid belt, but we would only be delaying our own inevitable demise and putting off the consequences of that type of exploitative behavior. What we have right now, and what's so interesting about this time in our lives as a species and the time in our lives as a mortal, who is not immortal, sadly, is that we are actually quite well poised as a collective global consciousness to turn back the tide of our own violent behaviors and species-wide destruction of our own environment in a way that would make our home more sustainable and livable for all of us. And we could then potentially move out into our solar system with more confidence and right to be there, in my ethical opinion. So I don't think that you can claim ownership of something, be a poor caretaker of it, and then say that you still have a right to it. If you decide that you own that land, it means the land also owns you. And that two-way street relationship has never been present in our general understanding of ownership and possession, but it has led to a significant amount of exploitation, oppression, and violence that is super unnecessary, actually. We can stop it together right now, even. So I do think that most or much of the struggle that we face as individuals or as a collective involves the existential threat of our ultimate demise and the terror that we feel facing a vast and infinite universe as such small finite creatures. It's quite terrifying, and that makes sense, and there is plenty of written work and different narratives in our traditions of storytelling and in present-day, modern-day depictions of what our universe looks like that supports and digs into this question of why are we here, what are we doing, and what is the meaning of all of this. And that question continues to get more confusing and more seemingly unanswerable as we understand more about our universe. It's one reason that people cop out so easily and so quickly as they grow in their understanding of everything we don't know. They get really, really scared of all of that unknown space. All of that darkness between stars is actually quite vast and could never be traveled in our lifetimes, and that's really upsetting. So the fear is a valid one. That existential threat is so normal of you. It's normal of all of us. But we enjoy being unique creatures, so being that predictably terrified of our mortality and the infinite nature of all things is a little too banal, and we have to have some kind of like spiced up unique reason to dislike other groups or feel ourselves entitled to and genuinely validated in this existential fear and threat. And nobody likes admitting that they're just sort of afraid to die. Although they would honestly be better off if they did admit they were afraid to die, because half the battle is just admitting it. Of course you're afraid to die. But if you admit that you're afraid to die, then you might have to admit that you actually enjoy living. And if you actually enjoy living, then you might have to admit that there is a lot about living that leaves something to be desired, right? So we do have this constant need to kind of reassure each other that we're all okay and everything's okay. I'm totally all right with the situation, even if you're really not all right with the situation, because we want connection and community and togetherness, and we don't want to be alienated, we don't want to be isolated or ostracized from one another. It's one of the most painful experiences that we have. In fact, most ostracism research in psychology has shown that even if you are being ostracized by the KKK or people who are ideologically very opposed or anathema to what your belief system is, you will still feel the pain of ostracism just as sharply. It actually doesn't matter who is excluding you for it to hurt. So just admitting that exclusion will hurt, even if people are racist assholes, is really important in understanding the way that we react to alienation, and that will go a long way in understanding the way that we will interact with literal aliens. I'm so funny. I think I'm so funny. Again, back to anthropologists and the first contact theory. When one cultural group, one regional group is introduced to another group, or the fact of that group's existence, the sheer knowledge of that other group's existence or potential existence completely changes that first group. It's impossible. Once you know about something, you can't take it back. And in much the same way, just being introduced to the idea that aliens might very well actually exist has directly changed humanity's perspective of itself in a way that's unalterable, and we can't put that cat back in the bag or that idea back into the box. The jack back in the box, I don't know. Back in the box. Yeah. So we're all sitting here with it, and we've seen sort of the history of the recent history, I should say, of this idea of aliens. Specifically, I'll talk about in America and American pop culture, much like I have before, but even more specifically, I'm going to go back to Contact by Carl Sagan, and point out that the ways in that book that people immediately or initially reacted to that first contact were very predictably human. They were very denial, acceptance, take us now, the aliens should just take over, we need to fight them. There's some very basic reactions that you would expect to see, so much so that it didn't seem far out to see it written down or depicted in that way in the book or in the movie. And maybe it's almost too familiar to us, in the sense that it's based on the way that we react to unknown groups or alien groups or yeah, those other ones. And so it just makes total sense. And that has an implication that us and the aliens are always, at some level, going to have a certain baseline functionality. Mostly sentience, conscious awareness, intentional care in some way. Those things seem to be fairly universal. And trying to imagine a species that doesn't have that, even within their own context of who they are, right? Like, they could be violent and horrible to humans, but for them, they're like good to their young. I mean, they're not, right? But we have this idea that through our understanding of ecology, of mammalian behavior, the insect-like behavior of our whole world, everything that we know about our world, and especially extremophiles or anything that has persisted in existing under extreme conditions, like the living organisms in the Mariana Trench or in methane lakes in Australia, other places like that that have extreme conditions, we still see life living. And so taking that and taking our knowledge of ourselves as thinking creatures and speculating about alien behavior has been sort of the work of our last, I would say, 50 to 80 years, really intensely. Yeah, so why do you think we're doing that? Is it because of the wow signal? I hope so. I really hope so. The wow signal and Carl Sagan the second direct contact was suspiciously close together, according to me personally. But Carl Sagan didn't direct contact. He also wrote a cosmological argument, which isn't even in this book. I want to go all the way back before we hit Sagan. I want to just hit Sagan. Oh, this was $11. $50. In Florida. This is this. This can't be mine. Okay, well, we saw that. Yeah, let's see. Plato, Aristotle, Sextus, Augustine, Anselm, Descartes, Good Guy, Gottfried, yes, Locke, indeed, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, of course. How can we forget Nietzsche? You can discuss philosophy. He is really prevalent right now. His ideology is experiencing slight renaissance with optimistic nihilism, which is nice. Okay, so Larry sat back because like I didn't see his name, but I saw I read it before. It was definitely one of these books. Oh, yes, he does. Where is this? Okay, I have this is. I much prefer copyright version. Sorry, published physical recursion. Records without hypothesis from various society experience. Get full access. Fuck you. This is life. Okay, whatever. Do we have to? Oh, it's just number 9. Okay, it started it out. Okay, cool. I was like, I know I have all these numbers. What's this? Okay, yeah. Changing. Although I'm still confused. If Sagan came up for me so strongly related to this book and how it's actually like up here in the book. I'm confused about that because I really thought, okay, then the next. Oh. Okay. This makes this a lot. I had a very good perception that the cosmological argument was what I was doing with the work of Sagan. I had it like pretty well down, but because it was on some notes, so that was kind of interesting crossfire. We'll just throw it into things. Yeah, the wait, it's minus. Yeah, it does start this. Evil, probably evil in nature, and then all this. The part that makes sense can be measurable, there can be other things. I mean, it sounds like promise of the series of causes is impossible. I mean, impossible, it's going down and down. Even causes of causes, in theory, because causes say on nothing, nothing, locally. After Robert helps to bring effect existence, whereas cause and necessity, which is things are causes, same effect. The parents of human beings and cause in theory, is it the beginning of important. That is something that we cause in theory, and I think the cause and necessity. I'm treating that as informed and in essence. I think is a bit forgotten. Okay, so after cosmological argument, there's physiological argument, which is about like form, volume, function. I talked about earlier. It's the logical here argument that I had mentioned a couple times. There's just like you're with saying causality, which is logic, and is made, and that's just a little on those at the same time. That like we're understanding the natural world, like natural philosophy, and variables, and we have really come a long way in understanding the entire universe to the extent we actually start seeing a little bit of potential, maybe possibly indications of design, such as issue. And there are much smaller indicators that are interesting. Not necessarily what we got, because it could very easily be a alien species with really massive energy purposes, right? When you want our children to go, no kidding, I am not trying to stay up to conspiracy hats. Oh my god, you heard this in one of these other conversations, and it sounds special. It's really cool and lofty and rational. Yeah, so let's see. Argument from design, scientific argument, basis of God, argument from religious experience, about evil, the various attributes of God, miracles, revelation, immortality, faith and reason, science, religion, evolution, business, achievements. There's somewhere. Religious pluralism? No. Oh my god, he's really not in here. How disappointing for me personally. One of the things that genuinely actually did convince me about, maybe not convince me that God exists, but was convincing enough that it stumped me, was this omniscience omnipotence and omnipresence are like the three characteristics that people consider when they're thinking about God. You think about all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present. And all-present is really interesting because it means that God can have to exist outside of time, or in a way that he can be present, or God could be present at every moment throughout time. In order to be omnipresent, you either have to be outside of time and be able to show up inside time at every time, or you would have to just be existing throughout all of time and space in one continuous like layer, I guess. And that's one reason I just went with love. I was like, that makes sense. Let's make it love. The energy of love can totally exist as an omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful being or energy or creature while still existing within and without us. So that one was easy for me. But the argument of like being all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present as our main three defining ways of conceptualizing God is really good. Like that's actually fairly accurate. And when we think about the meaning of life, I don't know that all of this discussion surrounding whether or not a higher power exists actually gives us meaning. And that's really one thing I want to ask all of the genuinely religious people out there who come into faith to their faith. How is Sky Daddy giving you meaning? How is the idea of a singular authority giving you a sense of purpose? How do you find purpose in something so rigid and hierarchical and overwhelmingly structured? I don't understand how that adds meaning or value to your life in itself. Love adds meaning and value. And from what I've read in religious and theologic writings, it's the worship of God that adds meaning. It's the ritual and practice and the embodiment of what is considered divine through the work of worship that is given meaning. I just don't understand how that is different from love and why it needs to be an external deity or any particular hierarchy related to deities for it to be actually meaningful. And I know I'm sticking with monotheism for the most part. I think I understand polytheism a lot better, actually, because it makes so much more sense to me. I used to joke that, and I still sort of act this way, but there's a god of everything. So there's a god of tacos, and there's a god of microphones, and a god of books, and a god of computers. And to me, that makes a lot more sense for there to just be a god for everything, and then they all exist within a different plane. And that's when it comes back to the realm of ideas and this idea of having creatures or spiritual entities that represent in the psychic realm the physical objects, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So kami creatures or many other areas of spiritual faith that conceptualize spirituality in that way, that all makes a lot more sense to me than monotheism and the Abrahamic religions in general. I tend to see Abrahamic faith as being deeply embedded in our understanding of interpersonal relationships and specifically into hierarchies among family dynamics. And I don't know if that is a effect of being surrounded by it my whole life and not being able to see outside of the family dynamic, or if that's just why it's so useful and why it has worked so well as a faith for humans for a long time. But I'm not really into it. I don't like Sky Daddy very much. I think it's kind of dumb. I love the way it's depicted in The Simpsons, I think, where he's like, just you can never see his head. I think I'm constantly joking about that whenever I'm talking like this. I'm like, yeah, I'm Sky Daddy right now, you know, like maybe unintentionally, and now I'm joking about it every time, but it's just so unnecessary. So anyway, I think I'm kind of over all this. I might be here for a long time, and we'll pull the philosophy back out if we need it. I'm sure we will again at some point. But I would love to just let you know in more detail. Just like this study field. So just this is wonderful. Wow. Nothing massacre. Wow. Okay, we're not gonna get that deep. I love telling the truth about the analyzing statistics. Oh my god, that's such a good one. We should do that. So good. I'm pretty sure that one is introductory in a different statistics book called Outliers. I could be wrong. From the panopticon to the busy world, the social order and orderly behavior depend on seen and unseen forms of social control. No shit. Yes. Yeah, I'm not trying to demean this particular branch of inquiry at all. The radical idea of marrying for love. Yeah, that's actually fairly recent. Arranged marriages are still very common in many parts of the world. Let's see if that works. Hell yeah. Here we go. That's one. 453. 453 and 51. Lisa Obama wrote his own speeches. Like, I felt bad comparing his and Trump's speeches earlier when I was talking about rhetoric. It's way better. And I'm pretty sure he wrote his own after being educated on the topic. And as much as that type of education is behind a hell of a lot of paywalls, at least he wrote it himself. Alright, let's see. Yes, the intro essentially says that this is the McDonaldization of society, sort of. George Pitzer, I have the full book, but this is the McDonaldization of social form from the sociology. But he's laying out essentially that we can think of efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control through non-human technology as the basic components of a rational system. Wow, okay. And that's essentially what McDonald's has been succeeding off of. The downsides of McDonaldization will be dealt with most systematically under the heading of the rationality. So that's right now. home setting in which to eat or to work. So now it's not actually going to tell me all that stuff about the potatoes. I'm going to have to go back to look. Okay. Truth, boundary lines, and statistics. What time to display this one? I think I read the case for statistics without reading, that particular thing. One of my biggest critiques for areas of academic inquiry with immediately applicable, realms of knowledge is that the application never gets done. Or it becomes outdated so quickly it doesn't matter anymore. Culturally speaking, for example, the awareness and literacy surrounding statistics outpace the scholars' warning about educational literacy surrounding statistics. And it feels like constantly, it feels like two dogs sniffing each other's butts in a circle, just coming round and round with this culture and academia thing. And nobody's actually exchanging information or doing any applying of the information. It's we study it, and then it doesn't end up being very useful for people who are being studied. And that's one of the foundational ethical rules of human subject research is it has to be useful to the people that are participating. It has to genuinely benefit them. And this isn't almost beyond critique on the human sciences, although a little bit of it is. It's more of a frustration with the lack of avenues for directly applied sociological or psychological research. And that mostly is a frustration of private interest groups, essentially. Private companies aren't bound by the same ethical concerns or considerations as scientists working at the university level or within accredited institutions. Those institutions have IRB boards, they have rules, they have ethics, they have things they have to meet in order to do the science, and private interest groups don't have to meet any of those baseline ethical concerns. That's why Facebook was able to manipulate its entire user base for purposes of research, and why they continue to do so. Again, the terms of service on Facebook essentially say, we get to do whatever we want with all of your personal data, and specifically the way you interrelate with your loved ones. It's literally the Liberty Garden of today. I said that the other day, and I don't know how many people actually understood me, but back in, I think it was World War II, the part of the way to ensure that we could continue producing for our war machine at the rate that we needed to do in order to continue participating in the war was partially women going into manufacturing and warfare. So great for us, but also partially was Liberty Bonds and Liberty Gardens, where average families across America took out loans essentially for the military industrial complex and in return received certain compensations and more or less, I'm kind of butchering it, just look at that part if you're really interested, but essentially there was wholesale citizenry buy-in that was felt in an embodied and physical way to the war effort, and at the time it was moral to do that. It was a moral request. Help us stop Hitler, help us stop the unacceptable murder of 11 million people in concentration camps and ghettos and ovens. And the American people bought into it. They said, yes, we don't want that. I will pay to end that. It was an entire generation that participated in that. And later, in Vietnam, it was not as easy of a moral sell. You couldn't ask these upright Christian folk to participate in Vietnam in the same way. And so a different type of moral argument needed to be made. At that time, it was more or less against the immoral behaviors of those participating in the cultural and sexual revolution, which, as we know, earned us a great deal of the legal protections and freedoms that we enjoy today. So it's pretty awful. But the Vietnam War actually relied fairly heavily on the draft. And again, with morality coming into the question, there was a certain amount of disdain for draft dodging, even among groups who didn't think that the war effort was ethical in the first place. There was a larger ethical sense that one should participate in one's country's efforts as a man, because again, draft only affected men. So that particular opinion of what your civic duty is superseded the potential uncertainty or outright dislike for the warfare that was being carried out in Vietnam. And what's interesting, exciting, and heartening is that a great deal of average citizens learned a lot about guerrilla warfare tactics by participating in the Vietnam War and also by hearing about it from their family members when they came back horrified and shell-shocked or experiencing complex PTSD. And so it became very obvious to those who enjoyed making war for the sake of money what was the most financially lucrative venture after oil. What was it then? Was it war? Yeah, it was. So after the Vietnam War, we had to come up with a more moral justification for increased warfare activity, right? Otherwise, we're not going to get whole-scale country buy-in from citizenry in our war efforts. So it might be useful for some of our citizens to die, threatened by scary brown people. All right, so let us discuss none of life. Well, so basically, I know I talked a lot about. Well, what I tried to do was I tried to orient you on my personal experience. I understood my positionality in bringing this conversation in the first place, so I felt we could do it, what kind of information that I'm pulling from, and also the general framework and perspectives that I'm using in order to construct these discussions. So, that we're going to leave it as we do want to reiterate that my model for knowledge seeking and construction and being a coherent whole generally involves identifying primary sources, historical timelines, and then understanding the literary work and influence of those times, as well as the religious and theological perspectives of those times, because I think it's very important to contextualize in a relatively sense the information that we're receiving about different parts of the world, different peoples, different events that have shaped our present day. Obviously, it's really difficult to do solid work, it's solid reading, I do a lot of reading, and overall, how useful it is. Well, the main thing I can say is that I almost never experienced the same type of uncertainty or deeply undermining existential threats that I notice a lot of my people do, my people, my folks, my contemporaries, people of my same age, or give or take 5 years down, 10 years up, which is generally how I think about it. The existential threat that I see most people suffering from does not touch me much at all, because you can't undermine my understanding of the meaning of life if I've created a really robust understanding of it on my own through a variety of different sources. So it does help. But digging into the meaning of life, I really did that because I was experiencing such a phenomenally massive existential threat and fear at an age where most of my peers were not contending with that sort of uncertainty. And as I mentioned before, that really had to do with my early exposure to family death during my childhood, and a variety of other things that kind of contributed to this maybe more than usual existential front. But I do stand by my previous 13-year-old self saying that life should be to have fun, so I've always tried to take that perspective and honor her view and her joy in the world, because I think that's very important. And so diving into these topics, I always attempt to come at it from a perspective of joy or play, and my understanding of debate and arguments really comes from that sportiness. I kind of said that as a debate club, and I gave you all these credentials for my rhetoric capacity that are traditional credentials, but honestly I was in debate for like maybe half a semester. I really didn't like it. I learned good stuff about it. I just thought it was a waste of time. Like, I thought I could figure out how to debate people just right on my own, but the internet thanks a lot. And it's not to say that I didn't learn anything from it, because I did learn about intentionally forcing myself to do devil's advocacy work. That was really important as far as my development and growth is as a critical thinker, and that sort of goes into the reductio ad absurdum practice of if we think that this is true, then let's just take the opposite and extend that argument to its logical conclusion, and if it is just as absurd as we think it is, then we can be more confident that what we think is true. That's a wonderful way to do it as well. It really offers this idea of falsification as a means of determining what's true, because false things will be false if you are trying to make them false, and you're doing your best to prove how false they are. The things that are true are just going to end up being. And again, that goes back into my argument surrounding art and entertainment, and critically examining the different means of communicating that we see in the world. You can get all of your information from reality TV if you want to. If you really want to get all your information from reality TV about the world, you can totally do that, but you have to be really good at figuring out what's a lie, what's embellished, what ways of being embellished, what perspectives it's coming from, and all of these different contextualizing pieces. So if that's your chosen medium for news consumption, that's fine, but you have to do it with that level of intent. And I, again, don't think most people have the confidence to do that kind of thing, or the understanding of how to construct a critically analyzing framework inside your mind to be able to do that with a whole lot of usefulness. So that's one of my frustrations in general. Like, we complain a lot about how there's only 6 media outlets in the world giving us news, and it's true, and it is super biased, but the types of complaints that I hear are the same type of complaints that children use. Like, hey dad, do it right. Like, you're literally begging a dominating abuse authority figure to be just and kind. At what point do you start taking responsibility for media consumption? If you are such a good consumer of media, entertainment, commodities, maybe figure out how to consume in a way that's actually useful to you, rather than continue to perpetuate doing that. But that's the Greek in me, and it has its drawbacks. I am really not good with I can't say any of that. I get frustrated with people complaining about things and not actually feeling empowered to do anything about it. And I know that they are conditioned to be giant babies about stuff, but it doesn't make me any less irritated to see so many adult babies in the world. I love babies though. Huge fan of children. Like, in a general sense, they are full of wonder and joy and playfulness, and they are silly and kind and awful and absolute terrorists and genuine psychopaths and sociopaths, because they have not been trained or taught how we socially relate. And I just adore that. I love all of the ways in which we as a community teach each other how to connect with each other. So, I get frustrated with the adult babies in the room, and exceptionally so when topics like Trump come up, because it is just deeply disheartening for somebody who has spent so long studying Greek statesmanship, essentially, to watch really poor speech givers win over so many people. Like, they're really bad at rhetoric. They're really bad at rhetoric. And I learned rhetoric from the perspective of Greek, in the sense of, this is a tradition of senator speech making that utilizes generally these 3 modes of speaking that are meant to stir the hearts of men. It's meant to ignite passion in your listeners. And so to hear or to read Trump's speeches, Obama's speeches, really, it's disheartening. When you read the speech and you read the rhetoric of our politicians, it is just sort of depressing how pathetic they are in compared, or within the context of the history of its tradition. The Greeks would be crying, probably are crying, watching this tradition of rhetoric get butchered in this way. And I know my heart is crying. I'm not even Greek, but I have Greek written on my shoulder blade. So I suppose I do have a little bit of a connection there. And I suppose we can start there. Give me 1 second. creed of how to get through the world, I thought it was really important, so I put it on myself and my body when I was, must have been 17, 18, something like that. Right around the same time I wrote this creed, 2009 it looks like. It goes, life paid me, spare me no pain that comes from living fully. Allow me the passion that comes from living fully. Sorry, I tried to do it from memory, I'll talk about it. Okay. Life take me, spare me no pain. Allow me the passions which come from living fully. Let no broken heart end my joy in you. Let no body stand in my way. Let every day be enriched with vigor, and let every night be fading yellow lights on the asphalt and cold stars. To live in apathy is to die alone and slowly. Let me love and hate. Let me renew the day. You give me passion, give me hope and temptation. Life overtake me until death has not a single grasp on my soul. Let me live eternal in your fullness. Let me survive the ages. Let me strive for light in shadows, and let me turn light into darkness. Above all, take me into freedom, where my spirit may soar. So that is, what I was working with at that age. Very, very passionate person. And it's no wonder that I focused on Greek statesmanship as a means of, or as a vehicle for change, because I wanted to be able to help change the world positively towards our growth and evolution as a species. Growing up in America, seeing genuine diversity of culture and people, getting to eat their food, but also huge amounts, and just seeing this inherited tradition of colonialism and the violence of it, and its effects on people, especially Native and Indigenous people, and wanting to do something useful about it, and knowing that my own identity ascribed and any achieved identity that I had would by default play into systemic injustice if I wasn't intentionally operationalizing the privilege or the inheritance of that colonial violence. And so statesmanship seemed the best route, but I really did not want to become a politician at all. Zero interest in that. I did not want to participate at that level, but I did think that it was really important to harness my understanding of civic duty in a way that would actually be beneficial to my fellow civilians. And again, I define civilian by anybody who lives on that land and is subject to those laws. If we're going to make immigrants subject to your laws, or if you're going to detain them indefinitely or abduct them, you can't also not give them rights. It's disgusting. So, knowing that that sort of thing was a system already, wanting to better define my understanding of statesmanship and civilianship and government and the social contract that people living in a community have with the community organizers or the people who are actively working to enact policy or legislation or any other state or federal level of change was an important part of trying to take the power back, essentially, and to operationalize my own power, and I felt legitimately useful. Did I go way too hard at it? Absolutely. Am I stoked that I did? Yes. So, so getting into theology and meaning life. We got hurt. We're going to start off with some really basic thinking about what that means. God damn it, no, I still need to historically contextualize like what's going on here. I started to do it in the last episode, so let's dive back into that. I think I mentioned that the socio-political situation at the time of Christianity really started taking off. It was like Rome was sort of starting to expand outwards, or had really sort of started taking over Greek life in a way where very erasive of the Greek. But Greek folk were adopting Christianity partially because it was very accessible to their pantheistic belief system. And at the time, Rome was very much like stamping out Christianity because of that, because worship of Mars and their appropriated versions of Greek deities was huge in pushing forth their militaristic and economic endeavors. Governmental is not the way that I want to say it, but the real word is lost to me right now. So that early application of Christian faith was actually quite edgy and transformative to the Greek people who were living under Roman regime. And at the time, the Christians and those early Christians, early adopted folk were persecuted by the Romans. And so we have very early Christian persecution right up front, all that way back. In the same way, there's the early persecution of the Jewish faith that you saw, and Islam faith too. Yeah, I mean, everybody's been persecuted. It's just the context and the impact of the larger historical narrative is ambiguous, very different. So you have this early Christian persecution by Romans, and the Romans actually adopted Christianity fairly late in their empire, and it was, I think, Julius, not Caesar, the different Julius, the Julian Barbarous, no, different, Julian Barbarous, yeah. Who was it? Do you know? No, it was a J name. I don't know. Sorry. Again, the whole can't remember specifics unless I fully adopt your faith sort of problem that I personally have. But it was some guy. No, it was a C. Constantine? It was not Constantine. Was it Constantine? I didn't Constantine. Was this the Istanbul versus Constantinople moment? Oh, it might have been, actually. Istanbul, Constantinople. That's the only way I remember it. Thank you, musicians. Once again, really hold it down for the entire human race. Anywho, yeah, there was some big military win that only happened because the guy in charge, I really think all the names I just threw out there were somewhere in here because I don't actually know a lot about history, but the guy in charge essentially converted to Christianity because he had this dream that he would win the thing. If he did, he sure did win the thing, and so he converted, and he forced conversion over a whole bunch of other people, and because the military wins just kept coming, that Christian conversion sort of swept across the Roman Empire in a way that essentially pretty much obliterated the appropriated Greek deity worship. Long story short, very long story, turned very, very short. So we haven't even discussed the Ottoman Empire and how it relates. Really, when I think about the Ottoman Empire, I actually have to use vampirism and Plantain Taylor and a book called The Historian by Elizabeth Kosova, because otherwise I would not be able to even penetrate psychically the knowledge about the Ottoman empires. We're not even going to get into that, because I want to talk about this schism between either Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism, or Catholic Christianity. And it really has to do with the Mediterranean and the terrain between Constantinople or Istanbul, Turkey, and Italy, and later with more influence and more interest, Germany, the UK. I keep wanting to add Ireland in there. I think I'm just like, I've been reading some Irish murder mysteries, so I'm keeping like, and Ireland was there too, but I really have stopped because they were not involved in that way. So yeah, Roman Empire, you have this adoption of Christian faith prior to, or very much in step with, the Roman conquest of more of the Western Europe, essentially, and into what is now the UK. Being in the military by default is only recently going out of vogue, and it's not like the draft is done. So to have young men growing up, psychologically speaking, understanding that they could be drafted into this horrific war machine at any time, and that they're meant to design themselves, to construct themselves, to stand ready for that, that's a lot of weight that you put on young boys. And there is the expectation that they may be treated in this way if they don't do it perfectly. That's threat, that's rape, that's the other side of rape culture we never discuss. I think it's well illuminated when you're thinking about homophobia and internalized homophobia as this concept of being afraid that some man will treat you the same way that you treat women. And there's a reason that you see solidarity between women and gay men in that sense. There's a lot of reasons for that, honestly. I don't know that are related to this, but since we're talking about rape culture and quantum physics and quantum psychology so in depth, it's important that I point all of this out and that I paint a larger picture of what that type of dominion looks like, and how emotionally resilient and sometimes necessarily shut down so many men are in the face of this type of systemic threat of domination. And it's no wonder they react so violently in response. When I was starting to first internalize the implications of quantum psychology, at the time I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, and I would never have been able to articulate it to the extent that I can now. But at that time, I realized that the reality of that level of awareness, that minute, in-the-moment presence to that much of a fine point, had implications for enthusiastic consent, that essentially I had to become very quickly, not okay with, but I had to very quickly and rapidly accept that there were many more times in my life that I was not consenting than I really cared to admit. I know I've talked a little bit about my experiences with date rape, which are just so common it doesn't feel worth talking about it within the context of rape culture, but that was the easy one to discuss. There have been plenty of times where I wanted to withdraw consent, change my mind, or say no, and it was so much easier to just not do that and to go along with whatever was going on. And when you're used to discounting those small moments as not being real enough, that type of less than microsecond thought as not being significant enough to matter, it's much easier to experience violation at that level and pass it off as not mattering. I do think this is what the snowflake complainers don't fully grasp, and I also think that it makes sense they can't grasp it, because similarly, if things are true at that level and real at that much of a microsecond level, and that capable of still being guided or decided upon or making changes from that level, that speed, that microsecond, less than microsecond time, that means they probably have a whole lot of things that they have either done or allowed to be done that are suddenly more significant within that timeline context. And probably it feels so overwhelming that it's so much easier to reject the entire idea of that level of consideration and care and granularity, especially related to consent, than it is to work through their own personal trauma, struggles, actions, behaviors. And it makes sense. It is one of the reasons so many men struggle with the topic of rape culture, outside of the fact that, again, they are constantly being psychologically, if not physically, raped or threatened with rape in ways that they can't articulate or acknowledge is actually happening. Outside of that part, I think watching men struggle with the concept of rape culture or with definitions of rape has been painful to watch, because you see them going through their sexual experiences that had previously been sitting with them, if not lightly, then not with a sense of potentially being a rapist. And they have to question, have I committed this sort of violation against people I was trying to love? And the answer is probably yeah. Hurt people hurt people. I do not know I don't know a man who didn't grow up under this particular silent culture of rape against men. see plenty of examples with men in sexual romantic relationships with other men working through that in a way that's healthy and positive and regaining ownership and power of their bodies and their psyche and their understanding of themselves in the world. And if internalized homophobia wasn't quite such a problem, there are so many things that heteronormative men could learn from those men. I would like to see heteronormativity go out the window in a general sense. Can we all just accept that sexuality is relatively fluid and changing and dependent on context and desire, more so than any rigid external societal rules? That drives me crazy, and to have rigid external societal rules for something so that should be so dynamic and unique between people. It's insane to me. But when I was initially trying to internalize this understanding of awareness and mindfulness at the level necessary to participate in quantum psychology usefully and to be stronger psychically, telepathically, and to work on these concepts, again, without using those words. If I had framed it that way to myself at the time, I wouldn't have gotten very far, because there is too much attitude and like knowledge structures related to it that are somewhat useless, but definitely restricting and weighty. So at the time I was just focusing on being present with myself, more present with myself, and in doing so, and thinking about rape culture and thinking about my experiences in sex, really, but throughout life, having to acknowledge these moments where I knew, thinking back, like, no, that was real. I actually wanted to just say no or stop or let's not do this anymore, and I didn't, because it was easier to just get through it. That was a violation, and it is rape, but it's not the kind of rape I could possibly blame my partner for, because I didn't give that indication. It's just something that at the time I knew in my head I wish I had done something different. So, I think a lot of time when we talk about violations, we want this straightforward, some bad guy did a bad thing and deserves to be punished for it. We want the vigilante justice, the satisfaction, the house at the end of the lane dad exploding the rapist's head at the end using my as an awful human being and I hate him and he hurt me or anything that easy, and it never is that easy. You have to tease out the nuance and understand and accept the way things work for you and what it means for you now and how it might impact your life in the future, and you have to hold that nuance forever. It's fucking hard. And the example I'm using is this guy Greg with the Winter's Hash thing. Like, that was awesome, right? Like, got this cool food recipe that I still use. It's my comfort food, it's my winter food. I shared it with multiple people. It's very basic, very Irish, and he was Irish, and we bonded over like a love of Celtic iconography and lore and all this stuff. But he also came to my 18th birthday party, shit all over the bathroom, pissed all over my friend's beautiful Persian rug, and then drunk out of his mind, came up to the bedroom where I was sleeping and sat next to me and breathed heavily, shirtless, while looking at me sleeping, pretending to sleep at that point. Obviously I'd woken up, and like just sat there breathing heavily, watching me sleep. And that wasn't the first time he had done it, and I could tell he was like actively holding himself back from some sort of forceful thing. And I kicked him out of the room, and I called my friend whose house it was to kind of like protectively wrangle, and it was a whole situation, and that makes me not like him. But he was hella drunk, he was an alcoholic, he had issues, and it always came out when he was drunk. So like, life is nuanced, man, and I have to understand my life within the context of that nuance, or I'll go fucking crazy. So when I think about men and the ways in which they are psychologically, in my opinion, violated by the system in this backdoor sort of way that makes them terrified of their own butts, I feel nothing but sympathy. And during that time recently, when I was silent and essentially defaulting to fascist norms, while I worked really heavily on internal stuff, some of which I've covered today, but plenty of which I've never touched on and probably won't discuss to protect the people that it involves, the placeholder that I used was the solidarity with men and white men, because I'm white and it's an easy bridge. I expanded and enlarged that perception of self-betrayal in that moment of what was anal rape, despite my partner not stopping, in order to hold onto and keep that empathy moving in me, so that I would continue to have pathways of empathy once I was able to repack my internal world and refocus on the external world. I didn't even realize I was doing it at the time. I just chose the thing that hurt the most. Self-betrayal. But my desire to stop and to change the rape culture that we live in is so strong. It has impacted my entire life in a generational sense. Watching fully grown adult men grooming young women and thinking, what the fuck is wrong with these people? Who hurt them and why and how? What made them, what trained them to think that this is an acceptable way to behave? And where the fuck is their backbone to not stop it themselves? And the way women are so frequently conditioned to be victims, to allow victimization, to participate actively in their own self-betrayal is horrific as well. It affects all of us. And the first time I ever saw anything addressing the way that privileged people are violated by the system, because they absolutely are. And it seems to me like the best way to end a system that perpetuates this level of violation to every citizen, regardless of privilege. The violation looks different, and it has an embodied, real, different impact on people's lives and livelihood and suffering. And I'm not saying that white men suffer more, I would never say that. But the fact that we don't discuss the way that the system violates them is frustrating to me in the extreme, because it would be really easy to focus on bringing that more to light in a way that hopefully creates allies out of those unthinking automaton tools. And of course, it's not the oppressed people's job to create that allyship. It's the job of the more privileged people. White women can get your white men kind of thing, a little bit. At least that's how I'm seeing it for myself. But I won't tell you how to do your solidarity relationships, because obviously mine are highly individualized, highly tailored, and somewhat fucked up. But I couldn't let that go. I couldn't let that go after loving and wanting to protect relationships and examples of relationships, of positive sexual loving, intimacy between men. I love it when men have feelings. I love it when men feel safe. I love it when men feel safe with me. I love it when we get to do sexy stuff with butts, and not just mine. What a weird one-way street. I hate that. Especially prostate. Like, I can't, like, how do you brainwash such a large group of people into, like, not even knowing or acknowledging that they have this pleasure center in them, and then also the lack of stimulation of that pleasure center is going to kill them earlier? Like, what? I can't. It's wild to me, but it shouldn't be too wild considering the way women, like, didn't even know that they had, that they peed out of their urethra hole until we all saw Orange is the New Black, right? And women's reproductive health, oh my god. Like, the shame of having, I'm trying to decide which word to use, the shame of having genitals is exceptional. And I used to blame Puritanism and this just like extreme Victorian era Christianity sort of thing, earlier than Victorianism even. But I used to blame that type of ideology, and I do still. American Puritanism is really intense, and it involves a lot of shame and a lot of guilt and a lot of blame, and we all practice and participate in perpetuating that to a certain extent, but I think there's something else going on here too. Okay, so happy New Year's Eve. This is the last episode of the year. And just ate lunch. So I talked in the last episode about men and rape culture, and about retroactively the ways in which my interpersonal experiences needed to be re-evaluated and recontextualized and re-understood for myself, with the assumption that the quantum below microsecond level of presence of my mind and my attention was valid and significant in my decision making. And as I realized that, as I mentioned, I started noticing different areas in which I had gone along with things I had actually which I hadn't. And I also discussed the ways in which women are conditioned to do that kind of thing, and to participate in or be complicit in different forms of violence from a very young age. It's something that I have struggled with as a person and as a tomboy throughout my life, this frustration with women's weakness or misogyny at the end of the day towards my own gender, or the gender I was assigned at birth. The trans erasure is real when you're non-binary, because like, it doesn't count. It just counts in a different way that I'm still learning and exploring. But this misogyny I've always been very careful of, because I recognized it from a young age as being sort of born from my frustration with the lack of seeming responsibility women take over situations like this. And it's a lot of why women stay in domestic abuse situations, feeling like they deserve it, or that it's their fault, or that it's inescapable. And this intentional curation of victimhood in women, and then also by women, is one of the most horrific things that I have ever seen. And when I talk about taking ownership of your decision making and your experiences and understanding in a victim empowerment way the nuances, that's one thing I almost never see with women taking responsibility for the ways in which they help to perpetuate harm. Because of this inborn assumption of victimhood, there's no possibility they could ever be perpetrators of violence. And it's an aspect of rape culture that does harm in the same way as I was previously describing men's privilege doing harm to them. And I don't know how to address it, and I never have, because kicking somebody while they're down does not help them get back up. So I've never known quite how to address it without being misogynistic or blaming women for the impact that rape culture has on them. But in the same way privilege deforms men and white men, the oppression of women in this way and the infantilization of them makes it very difficult for them, or more difficult for them, to take responsibility and ownership for their own lives and their own actions. And that is a genuine issue that we are struggling with. When you grow up conditioned to be dependent, finding and struggling for and fighting for independence is harder. I was raised without a father, and the assumption that my lack of a father figure would impact my life in an astronomically negative way was prevalent throughout my early childhood. It never really came from my mom, but it was around. And the older I got, the more frustrated I got with that assumption, because it seemed to me that the main thing that was impacting me when it came to my lack of a father was how important my lack of a father seemed to be to everyone else but me. I barely missed them. I had plenty of positive male role models in my life in the form of my older cousins and my uncles and teachers that I admired, and other forms of positive male influence. Authors, for example, those people are still real, right? people in movies are still real people, actors are real people, directors are real people, doing real things, being truly influential. There's plenty of positive male role models in the world. I don't need a direct fatherly one to get the benefit of it. And I get that there's plenty of stuff that I'll never actually understand about what it's like to grow up with a dad, but I'm kind of okay with that. I'm more frustrated with the fact that my lack of father is being blamed for a variety of things, including my attitude issues. Trust me, that's more about something else. But my mom was kind of scared, or I got the sense that there was a fear of my being taken advantage of by men, or that is something that would happen, and that she wanted to protect me from. It's not an unreasonable fear for a single mom to have. When you're trying to raise a daughter, it's pretty scary. You think about her going out in the world, potentially being hurt by the rape culture that we all know we're living in. The father figure is meant to be protective from that culture, I believe. Although, by doing so, he perpetuates it. And because that overarching miasmic fear existed in my young adulthood, and I was the kind of kid who wanted to make my mom happy and to prove to her that there was nothing to be afraid of, that guys were not that scary. And because of my early exposure to the open web, as I have mentioned several times, at the tender age of 11, I, in a somewhat Elliot Page hard candy sort of way, sought out men in a challenge kind of way to see if they were really that scary, or if they could be that scary. And that's how I found that guy that I was telling you about, who, like, in a positive way told me he could beat me in the military if we got married. Like, that's where I was finding these people. And I would find people and I would meet up with them in an edgy sort of way. I was confident that I could judge people based on their energy and the way they interacted with me, and that I could trust my own judgment about that, and that no matter what, I would get what I wanted from the situation without them having to have any particular power over my personal narrative. And despite how somewhat messed up that is, that was the way that I chose to handle this concern surrounding my independence, and to give myself the assurance that I could be an independent, autonomous creature. So when I talk about that older guy that I dated and slept with, I don't know that many people in his position would have been able to resist the concentrated effort of an incredibly intelligent, persistent young woman who very much constantly acted far older than her age. Does that excuse it? No. You're still an adult when I am a child, and you should have fucking control yourself. And I would expect adults in that situation to be more of an adult. But as I mentioned before, he was hiding from the responsibility of adulthood. He was trying to, like, return to high school in an emotional and spiritual way. And in the time that we were with one another, we were more or less meeting each other on equal ground. Obviously not completely. But this is what I'm trying to illuminate about rape culture, and I hope it's coming clear. I know talking about these topics can be so triggering and so sensitive that it's hard to hear the point. But none of this would have happened under conditions where women were actually equal, or actually treated as equals, who weren't conditioned to be victims, to be subservient, to be dependent, where that wasn't the assumption. Child marriages still exist in many different parts of the world. This is a historic, generational practice that we are only seeing ourselves growing out of now. I'm so stoked that I grew up without knowing my father. I did later meet him and learn about him and come to understand why my family protected me from even the knowledge of his presence. But that was when I was 18 and an adult, and I asked for that knowledge and I was given it, and then I sought it out even further by meeting him. And you know what the most important, most impactful part of meeting my father was? Getting to know his new wife, admiring her, learning her trade as a network infrastructure telecommunication company. That was so much more useful than actually meeting my father. That part wasn't really that exciting. He was just about the same level of shitty that I kind of expected. And did his new wife end up dumping him? Yeah, she did. He was not a great person, and he continued to not be a great person. His main skill was finding women who were incredibly powerful, incredibly strong, and somewhat of a sucker for a sob story and a cute face. The women in my life have impacted my life so much more than the men in my life have, and yet somehow it's still always about them. My behavior is considered fatherless daddy issue behavior because it has to be about dads. It's definitely not the fact that I want to reassure my mom that there's nothing in life that I would ever be in danger from. It's definitely not me trying to reassure her that the world outside isn't really that scary, and even the scary men can be handled by me. And it's not like I didn't demonstrate that. No, it's still somehow about the guys. Somehow. This is rape culture. And this is the way in which women are conditioned to assume that that's the way that it needs to be. That men are, due to their physical strength and theoretical logical acumen, the obvious dominant party of the genders. You can understand my frustration here. And it's one reason I've always struggled with trying to have relationships with women, like romantic relationships with women. I've never felt like it was a fair power dynamic. I have always felt more independent than most women I know. I get pigeonholed into the daddy role, and I don't like the whole, calling chopsticks a fork and a spoon and a fork when they're chopsticks. It's not that. And I recognize that my exposure to women-loving women relationships or people was, up until more recently, fairly limited and young. I'm 30 years old. There's plenty more, 32. There's plenty more potential for exploring romantic, sexual-loving relationships with women in a way that does feel equal and that doesn't feel like an awkward power dynamic that I'm getting put into a certain role purely because of my independence and masculine tendencies. I don't want to call you that because it's not inherently masculine. But that's rape culture. Like, I cannot express enough that that is rape culture. And the fact that
everything I got from that relationship with the older guy and the way that it helped me in my life, the way that that friendship grounded me in my life, the many benefits I got out of that are for him overshadowed, and in a larger sense when the story gets told, overshadowed in a way that turns me into a victim and him into a bad guy is a natural conclusion of living in a rape culture, because how else can we view that? It's unthinkable that she just used the parts that were good for her and moved on with her life, because that would be way too autonomous for a mere woman to do, right? Like, victim empowerment is so hard because victimhood is assumed to be a powerless position. It's beneficial for victimhood to continue to be a powerless position for those in power, those who are perpetuating re-victimization. So in all my life, I will be up to 90 with frustration with women not taking their own power back, not operationalizing their own power, not accepting being victimized without necessarily internalizing victimhood as a subservient, dependent situation. Because no matter what, they are literally the victims there. She wasn't asking for it. She was conditioned to be that dependent. She is fighting through so much unseen conditioning and trauma to become independent. That's why I support women's wrongs. That's why I love crazy women. I'm like, you're not crazy. You're reacting in a very normal way to very abnormal, shitty situations. Almost every time. There's no way. I'm sorry. And the amount of times that women apologize drives me crazy, even though I know I also do it, right? I got a friend the other day who was like, oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to, I'm sorry. I'm like, oh, please stop. I love you. There's no need to be sorry. Yeah, gosh, 20 minutes and I don't know what else to say here. We still have a wage gap. We still have gross inequity between genders, and we're only talking in gender dichotomies here, not even considering non-binary perspectives or the spectrum that we really should be thinking about gender upon. And trans women get it, in 10 different worse ways. And then cis women and their lack of solidarity with trans women, I'm like, you could actually grow and become so much more independent if you figured out how to love trans women as though they are fellow sisters. But you're too lazy to do that. That's what I see with cis women, and it drives me nuts. People with privilege have so much extra space, and they fill it up with trash. They fill it with mindless bullshit. All of these little jokes about all the things that you bought on Temu as haha, I'm so bad, but I couldn't fucking help it. I'm like, yeah, you fucking could. You're ruining the environment for the sake of temporary instant emotional gratification to fill a giant hole inside of you that you're actively avoiding doing anything useful about. That's on you, girlfriend. That's a you problem. Cis women disgust me in that sense. And it is a cis woman problem. Any trans women who are struggling with Temu addictions, I'm giving you a pass. If you have it hard enough, go ahead and fill that void, girlfriend. I shouldn't have to point out that men disgust me at the same level, especially heteronormative cis men. Disgust me in much the same way, in their lack of empathy, lack of solidarity, lack of genuinely supporting women. You could be doing so much more. So much more. You have so much extra room in your head and in your life. But I guess they spend way too much time trying to figure out how to protect women in a way that improves their sense of their own masculinity rather than actually how can we help women. I think that goes back to that fragile masculinity, that instability, lack of security in masculinity, which I cannot stress enough, definitely has something to do with your relationship with your own ass. I don't know why I've decided that the end of the year is the time to let everybody know what annoys me about them. But I have been working through a lot lately. And one of the problems for women and people who are socialized as women is this conditioned behavior of considering the well-being, both emotional and physical well-being of the people around them before considering their own well-being. That is, it goes in direct opposition to what I've consistently been talking about when it comes to spheres of influence and doing your internal shadow work before reaching out to the people around you to do interpersonal work. Women are conditioned to do the opposite thing, to see themselves only through the eyes of the people around them, to think that it is evil or bad or self-centered, selfish, self-indulgent, in some way completely unacceptable to first look after and look at themselves with their own eyes and make judgments and assessments that way. The way that men are conditioned to do on their own as individuals, as independent, autonomous people who have the privilege of being considered independent, autonomous people by default, women are not given that assumption. And you can blame evolutionary groupings of genders around childcare and warfare, but that only goes so far. You don't want to be considered animals unless it's convenient to blame your animal nature for your behavior. We are products of our environment, we're products of our genetics, we're products of our social groups. We are responding as animals to these stimuli. We do have the ability to notice, to direct our attention, to decide what receives our attention. One thing I've noticed with women when they begin the journey of genuinely looking at themselves through their own eyes and working to have an understanding of self and a more secure self-concept that starts out from the premise of looking at themselves and being the first judger of themselves rather than looking to the judgment of others to determine understanding of self. One thing I've noticed in all women, including me, going through that process has been this just complete lack of understanding where to start and an overwhelming sense of dispiritedness. To realize that your entire perception of self has been constructed through the lens of how others view you. Not even how others actually view you, but how you perceive others viewing you. That is so exhausting. To be like, oh no, now you have to do something. Like, you mean I have to view myself and decide how I view myself based on what? I can't use other people's relational idea of that. I have to use my own. How do I do that? You mean I have to come up with opinions that I can justify to myself about how people should be based on what I see around me and in a way that doesn't make me feel like mean or cruel or judgy? That goes against everything women are conditioned to do. We're conditioned to be caregivers and nurturers, caretakers, mediators, problem solvers, peacemakers, keeping things nice. But we all know the harm that Mother Dearest does when she wants to enforce niceness over reality, or preserve concepts of self over the well-being of her children. We know how much harm that does. All of us do. And once you start really digging into what your opinions are and what you think about stuff and giving yourself permission to say, no, I don't care about your opinion of me, or I'm not really interested in hearing about that, or that seems like a waste of my time, starting to value your time in that sense is hugely empowering and hugely powerful. My frustration over the ways that the disproportionate ways in which the men in my life are weighted by outside judges about my life is understandably frustrating when it's my life. My narrative, my perception of the story, what I'm taking from this and using it for, in theory, should be the more important aspect. If I was a man, you would assume that would be the important aspect of my experiences. Going through warfare, for example, or extreme conditions, say I'm a man and I get into a fist fight at a bar, nobody is overly concerned about whether my opponent is going to impact my life emotionally and psychologically for the rest of my life because he was a big scary guy that I fought. No one's thinking that. That was a bad example. But it's a really hard topic to discuss, and I'm probably filling it with all sorts of biased beliefs and behaviors that are only mine. But women do a lot of harm that they don't take responsibility for by allowing their dependencies to continue. It's another reason I have empathy for men. I try and build solidarity relationships across divides I don't understand wherever I can, because obviously I feel like that might improve the world. And I like guys. In a lot of ways, I'm more comfortable around men, because there isn't a baseline assumption that I'm going to share myself with them. And I hate that baseline assumption. I love sharing, don't get me wrong. And I love the strong, resilient, interdependent communities that women grow together when they are sharing with intention with each other, and creating those network relationships is a beautiful thing. More often than not, sharing as an assumption, as a default, is toxic. You aren't entitled to every last emotion that I experience or every last thought that I have just because we're both girls, and it's weird that you would assume that. And in the same way, I'm not entitled to yours. I'm not entitled to any part of you. And you always assume I am. Of course I never want to interact with women at that point. And it's just a certain amount of internalized rape culture that often we can't escape from. I've participated in it and perpetuated it myself. I'm trying not to. I don't owe anybody anything. I don't either. Whatever I've shared with you, whatever I've given you, has been with knowing intention and a free hand. And I'm more often than not convinced that other women feel the same way. And maybe that's just misogyny. Could be. But the world as I have seen it, pitting myself against the scariest men and realizing how unscary they are. The scariest circumstances, the scariest thing that anybody could conceive of telling me might happen to me as a lone woman in the world. I wouldn't sought that out as a teenager because I didn't want it to stop me from living my life. And was that a little bit psycho of me? Yeah, but did it give me a great deal of confidence moving forward? Yeah, it did. Once I had conquered the scariest thing, what else was out there to worry about? Turns out I had to worry about getting back in touch with my own emotions and being emotionally present with myself after kind of training myself to be emotionally closed off. But we all have to come full circle on something. And I get so frustrated that my friends, like my women friends, have the sort of bad boundaries